Well, there's no more of them, number one. I mean, there'll never be another 63 Dodge or a 65 Chevelle or whatever. There's no more of them. But this is kind of like Fantasyland here, too. I mean, I don't know if this is the real world or not, just to be very honest.
There is a strange kind of silence that settles over a workshop after the person who gave it meaning is gone. The tools remain exactly where they were left. Half-finished body panels sit on stands. Machines wait in the same corners. And unfinished cars seem to be frozen in time, as if their builders might walk through the door at any moment and continue the work. That was the atmosphere surrounding Boyd Coddington's shop after his death. For decades, the name Boyd Coddington had been almost impossible to separate from American hot rod culture. His cars weren't simply modified vehicles. They were carefully constructed pieces of automotive design, shaped by a combination of old-school craftsmanship and machinist-level precision. But when Boyd was gone, something became painfully clear. The shop could continue operating. The employees could keep building cars. The equipment could remain. But Boyd Coddington himself could never be replaced. And when people eventually looked at what remained inside his shop, they discovered something far more significant than a collection of tools and unfinished projects. They found the physical remains of a career that had changed the custom car industry forever. Boyd Coddington was born in 1944 and raised in rural Idaho, a world that seemed far removed from the Southern California hot rod scene he would eventually dominate. His early training wasn't in television, celebrity culture, or automotive design. He trained as a machinist. That background would become one of the most important parts of his career. Machining taught Boyd to think about precision, measurements, tolerances, and details. Years later, he would bring that same mentality into the world of custom cars, where appearance and craftsmanship had to work together. In 1968, Boyd moved to California with a dream of building hot rods. But dreams don't always pay the bills. For a period, Boyd worked the night shift as a machinist at Disneyland while spending his days building cars from his home workshop. It was an exhausting double life, but it gave him something more valuable than comfort: experience. Eventually, the backyard operation became too successful to remain a side project. In 1977, Boyd opened Hot Rods by Boyd in Stanton, California. At first, it was another custom car shop. But it didn't stay that way for long. One of the early turning points came with a 1933 Ford Coupe built for customer Vern Luce. The car won the Al Sloniker Award at the 1981 Oakland Roadster Show, giving Boyd the kind of recognition that could transform a talented builder into an industry name. Soon, people began noticing something different about his cars. Boyd wasn't interested in simply adding more chrome, more accessories, or more decoration. His philosophy was almost the opposite. Remove what didn't belong. Smooth the body. Clean up the lines. Make the modifications look as though they were part of the original design. That approach eventually became recognizable as the Boyd look. And once you knew what you were looking for, you could often recognize one of his cars without even seeing the name attached to it. As the reputation of Hot Rods by Boyd grew, the operation eventually moved to a larger facility in La Habra, California. But Boyd's ambitions were much bigger than building custom cars. In 1988, he launched Boyd's Wheels, a company centered around something that would become one of his biggest contributions to the hot rod world: billet aluminum wheels. Instead of relying on conventional cast wheels, Boyd developed wheels machined from solid aluminum. They were originally intended to complement individual custom builds, but the idea caught on. Soon, the wheels became a major business. And the nickname followed: Billet Boyd. The man who had once been working nights and building cars in a backyard was now becoming one of the most recognizable figures in the American custom car industry. His achievements continued to pile up. Boyd-built cars won the prestigious America's Most Beautiful Roadster Award 7 times, a record that became one of the defining statistics of his career. He was also inducted into multiple automotive halls of fame, including the SEMA Hall of Fame, the Hot Rod Hall of Fame, and the Grand National Roadster Show Hall of Fame. But perhaps the clearest evidence of Boyd's influence wasn't found on a trophy shelf. It was found in the cars themselves. By the 1990s, a Hot Rods by Boyd creation could be an almost complete transformation of its donor vehicle. A customer might bring in a classic car, but what came out months later could look like something entirely different. Panels were reshaped by hand. Door handles disappeared. Body lines were cleaned up. Proportions were changed. And because so much of the work was performed by hand, the prices reflected the labor. Some commissions reportedly reached hundreds of thousands of dollars. One of the most famous examples was a 1948 Cadillac Fastback commissioned by ZZ Top guitarist Billy Gibbons. The result was the legendary Cadzilla. The original Cadillac became the starting point for something that looked almost like a concept car brought to life. The roof was chopped, the rear section reshaped, and much of the exterior was reworked with hand-formed metal. Cadzilla eventually became more than just a custom hot rod. It became automotive art. And that was the strange thing about Boyd's creations. They could begin life as ordinary or forgotten automobiles, but after passing through his shop, they could become objects that collectors treated almost like sculptures. Then television arrived. When TLC and later Discovery Channel aired American Hot Rod, millions of viewers suddenly gained access to a world that had previously been known mainly to car enthusiasts. But the show didn't simply reveal how beautiful Boyd's cars were. It revealed the pressure required to create them. Deadlines were brutal. Standards were extremely high. Arguments were common. Employees came and went. And Boyd's perfectionism became one of the central elements of the program. For viewers, it made compelling television. For people working inside the shop, it could be a very different experience. Yet the same environment that created tension also produced talent. Chip Foose worked with Boyd before becoming one of the most recognized designers and builders in the custom car world himself. Jesse James also apprenticed under Boyd before eventually launching his own operation. In that sense, Hot Rods by Boyd wasn't merely a car shop. It became a training ground. A generation of builders passed through those doors, learned Boyd's approach to proportions and fabrication, and then carried those lessons into their own careers. But Boyd's entire empire had one unavoidable weakness. It depended heavily on Boyd himself. People could learn his techniques. They could operate his machinery. They could build cars using his methods. But his eye, his approval, and his ability to envision the finished vehicle were much harder to reproduce. That became painfully important in 2008. Boyd Coddington died on February 27, 2008, at the age of 63. He had experienced serious health problems, including complications following surgery, and his death brought an abrupt end to one of the most influential careers in custom car history. The shock wasn't limited to his family or employees. His businesses suddenly had to answer a question nobody had been able to avoid forever. What happens to a company when the person whose name is on the door is gone? For a short period, the operation continued. But the situation didn't last. On June 20, 2008, less than 4 months after Boyd's death, Hot Rods by Boyd officially closed its La Habra doors. The employees were let go. Cars that were still being built were moved elsewhere. Some former employees opened their own shops and continued using the skills they had learned under Boyd. The wheel business followed a separate path. But the original shop was finished. And that was when the value of Boyd's existing work began to take on a different meaning. Before his death, collectors could always imagine another Boyd car being built. After his death, that possibility disappeared. There would never be another genuine Boyd Coddington original built from start to finish under his direction. Suddenly, scarcity was permanent. Cars that had already been valuable became even more significant. One example was Chazum, an aircraft-inspired custom that had been built for customer Joe Rogan. When it sold at auction in 2005, it brought $372,600. Another example was the Automotive, a vehicle created under enormous production pressure during the American hot rod era. The car reportedly required thousands of labor hours and was completed in an extremely short period. It first sold at auction for $167,400. Later, it changed hands for $187,000. Then, in 2017, it appeared at a Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale and sold again for $132,000. The numbers varied, but the important point was that Boyd's creations continued to attract serious attention long after the shop itself had disappeared. Even unfinished cars could command significant money. At one Scottsdale auction, incomplete 1940 Ford Customs from Boyd's shop were offered to collectors. They weren't finished. They weren't ready to drive. But they carried something that could never be added later. Boyd's fingerprints were already in the work. That distinction matters. An unfinished Boyd project wasn't simply an incomplete car. It was a frozen moment in the history of the shop. Once Boyd was gone, nobody could genuinely recreate the exact circumstances under which those cars had been started. That is why collectors could look at unfinished metal and see something closer to an artifact than a failed project. It also explains why the garage itself became so fascinating. The real secret wasn't a hidden prototype waiting under a cover. It wasn't some forgotten invention. It wasn't a mysterious car that Boyd had secretly built for himself. The secret was much simpler. The garage contained evidence of a process that could no longer be repeated. Every unfinished panel represented a piece of a method that had been developed over decades. Every jig, machine, and workbench was part of an environment that had produced some of America's most recognizable custom cars. And every incomplete project became a reminder that Boyd's final car had already been built by history itself. Of course, Boyd's legacy wasn't perfect. The television show exposed the difficult side of his personality, and not everyone who worked for him remembered the experience fondly. His perfectionism could create extraordinary results, but it could also create enormous pressure. There were conflicts inside the business, financial problems, employee departures, and disagreements that became part of the broader story. That complexity is important because legends are rarely simple. The same man who could demand impossible levels of craftsmanship could also inspire people who went on to become stars themselves. The same shop that created tension also created careers. And the same demanding standards that exhausted employees helped establish a design philosophy that influenced an entire generation. That's probably the most important part of Boyd Coddington's legacy. He didn't simply build cars. He created a language. Smooth bodywork. Clean proportions. Shaved trim. Custom billet wheels. Classic shapes combined with modern precision. His designs demonstrated that a hot rod didn't have to look overloaded to be impressive. Sometimes, the most difficult thing a builder can do is remove everything unnecessary and leave behind only the lines that matter. That philosophy survived Boyd. It survived the closing of his shop. And it survived the sale of his unfinished projects. It lived on through former employees, designers, builders, and countless enthusiasts who adopted pieces of his approach. So when people eventually looked inside Boyd Coddington's old garage, they weren't simply looking at an abandoned workplace. They were looking at a historical record. A record of 7 America's most beautiful Roadster victories. A record of major awards and Hall of Fame honors. A record of cars that would later sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And a record of a man whose influence reached far beyond the vehicles carrying his name. The most fascinating thing about the garage was what it represented. Before Boyd died, an unfinished car was simply a project waiting for tomorrow. After he died, some of those same unfinished cars became the last physical evidence of a process that could never happen again. That is what made the garage so important. The tools couldn't finish the cars. The machines couldn't replace the man. And another builder could imitate the style, but could never truly recreate the exact moment in history when Boyd Coddington stood over a piece of metal and decided what it needed to become. Most craftsmen have the luxury of slowly disappearing. Their production decreases. Their careers wind down. The market has time to adjust. Boyd didn't get that ending. His story stopped suddenly in the middle of an active era, with projects still unfinished and a television audience still watching. And perhaps that's why people remain fascinated by what was left behind. Because the garage wasn't just the end of Boyd Coddington's story. In many ways, it was the beginning of his legend. The cars remained. The techniques survived. The former employees carried his lessons into new shops. And collectors continued to search for the vehicles that could honestly be traced back to his hands. The secret Boyd took to the grave was never hidden behind a locked door. It was something the industry slowly understood after he was gone. Boyd Coddington wasn't simply building cars. He was building something that would become impossible to reproduce once he was no longer there. And that may be the greatest value hidden inside his old garage, not another $1 million car, not another trophy, but the final evidence of a craftsman whose work had reached the point where his absence became part of its value. Because once the doors closed, one thing became certain. There would never be another Boyd Coddington shop exactly like it. And there would never be another Boyd Coddington.